The microphone was already in my son's mother-in-law's hand when she turned to face the table where I was sitting and smiled the kind of smile that has nothing warm behind it. She said, "I want to take a moment to acknowledge Daniel's mother. She raised him alone, which explains, well, certain things." The rehearsal dinner went quiet. 50 people around long white tables with candles and fresh flowers all turned to look at me. My son Daniel froze beside his fiancée Sophie. I saw his hand tighten around hers. Sophie's eyes went wide, and she looked at her mother with something between shock and guilt, like she had seen this coming and prayed it wouldn't. I sat very still. I kept my hands flat on the table because they wanted to shake. My daughter-in-law's mother, Eleanor, continued with that same steady smile. "Single mothers work so hard, bless their hearts, but there are things a boy only learns when he grows up in a complete home, things like presence, stability, knowing your place at the table." A few people laughed politely, the nervous kind of laugh people give when they don't know what else to do with the air in the room. My chest went tight, my ears rang, and then something else happened, something I did not expect. Eleanor looked directly at me, and for just 1 second, something moved across her face. Not cruelty, not amusement, fear. It was gone so fast I almost didn't catch it, but I caught it. I set my napkin on the table, stood slowly, and looked straight back at her. "Eleanor," I said, keeping my voice very calm, "I think you and I should have a conversation before the wedding tomorrow, because I believe you already know why." The room went even quieter. Eleanor's smile stayed in place, but her eyes did not, and sitting there in that beautiful rented hall with the candles burning, and my son's hand now squeezing Sophie's like a lifeline, I understood something that changed the shape of the entire evening. Eleanor Hargrove had not insulted me because she looked down on single mothers. She had insulted me because she was hoping to make me feel too small to speak, and there was only one reason a woman like her would need me to be silent. She recognized me, and she was afraid of what I remembered. I will start at the beginning, because the beginning matters more than people realize when they only see the ending. I raised my son Daniel by myself from the time he was 4 years old. His father was a good man for a while, and then he became a different kind of man, the kind who stays just long enough to make leaving hurt more. He moved to another state when Daniel was in preschool. He sent birthday cards for 2 years, and then he stopped. I did not run after him and I did not fall apart. I had a little boy who needed breakfast every morning and clean socks and someone to sit with him when the thunder was loud. I was a registered nurse. I worked the night shift at Mercy General 3 times a week and picked up extra hours at a clinic on the other days. Daniel used to sleep at my sister's house on my long nights. He never once complained about it. He was the kind of child who understood more than he was supposed to and chose kindness anyway. When Daniel was 7, we moved into a small house with a cracked driveway and a yard that got too much sun. I planted tomatoes along the fence because they were cheap and because something about watching things grow made the hard days easier. Daniel used to water them every evening after school. He took it seriously, like it was a responsibility he had been trusted with. Those years were not easy. I will not pretend they were. There were months where I moved money between accounts, just to keep the lights on. There were nights I sat at the kitchen table after Daniel went to sleep and let myself cry for exactly 10 minutes, and then I washed my face and went to bed because morning comes whether you are ready or not, but I never let Daniel feel the weight of it. I wanted him to feel like the world was solid under his feet even when I was the only thing holding the floor up. He grew into someone I am proud of in a way I cannot fully put into words. He became an engineer, not because I pushed him, because he loved how things worked, how pieces fit together, how a system could be made better with patience and thought. He was the kind of young man who helped elderly neighbors carry groceries and remembered to call me on random Tuesdays just to talk. Then he met Sophie. He met her at a work conference in Nashville. She worked in sustainable development and she talked about it with the kind of energy that makes you want to know more, just by watching someone's face. Daniel called me the night after they met, and I could hear something different in his voice. Something settled and lit up at the same time. I said, "Tell me about her." He talked for 40 minutes. I loved Sophie before I ever met her in person. She was funny and direct, and she hugged me the first time like she meant it. She looked at my son the way a person looks at something they plan to take care of. And then I met her mother. Eleanor Hargrove was the kind of woman who walked into a room and made it rearrange itself around her. She was in her mid-60s, trim, with silver hair cut in a way that cost money and knew it. She was the CEO of a real estate development company that operated across 4 states. She wore clothes that had no visible price tags, because the price was not the point. The point was that you understood, without being told, that she had earned the right to take up space. The first time we had dinner together, the four of us at a restaurant she chose, she asked me what I did for work. I told her I was a retired nurse. She nodded slowly, like I had answered a question she already knew the answer to. Nursing is so important, she said. Those people are the backbone of the system. The way she said those people told me everything I needed to know about how she saw the distance between us. She asked about the hospital I had worked at. I mentioned Mercy General. Something shifted in her face for less than a second. She picked up her water glass. And before that? She asked. Street Augustine Medical Center, I said. Before they closed the cardiac unit. Eleanor set her glass down carefully. How interesting, she said. And then she changed the subject entirely. That night, driving home alone, I tried to remember where I had seen her face before. Not at a dinner, not at a social event, somewhere more serious than that, somewhere with fluorescent lights and formal language. It stayed at the edge of my memory like a word you cannot quite reach. I did not sleep well that night. As the engagement moved forward, Eleanor was polite to me in public and distant in every other way. She did not include me in wedding planning conversations. She would forward emails to Sophie and Daniel and CC, my address at the bottom like an afterthought. When I suggested a florist I knew, Eleanor had already booked a different one. When I offered to help address invitations, Eleanor's assistant handled it. I told myself this was just how some mothers were with daughters-in-law's families. Territorial, protective of their event. But Daniel came to me one evening and sat down at my kitchen table the way he used to sit when he was 12, and something was bothering him. He said, "Mom, Eleanor told Sophie she thinks you're going to cause drama." I looked at my son. Drama. He nodded. She said, "Single mothers have she used the phrase unresolved wounds, and that you might not handle the wedding well." I was quiet for a moment. I asked him if Sophie agreed. He said Sophie had argued with her mother about it, that Sophie told Eleanor to stop, that Sophie had cried. I reached across the table and put my hand over my son's. I told him that I raised him to walk into a room and make people feel safe, not small, and that Eleanor was not going to change that. He nodded, but his eyes still had worry in them. The worry of a man who loves two people and can feel them pulling in opposite directions. That was the moment I started to look harder, not at Eleanor's behavior, but at her history. I am a nurse. I believe in getting the full picture before you decide what you are dealing with. I remembered on a Tuesday night in February, 3 months before the wedding. I was going through old boxes in my spare room, the kind of boxes that accumulate over a life and never get fully unpacked. In the bottom of one box, under medical licensing paperwork and continuing education certificates, I found a folder I had carried with me through 4 moves without ever opening. Inside was a deposition transcript. My name was at the top, and across from my name, in the documentation of the opposing party's legal representation, was the name of a corporation called Hargrove Development LLC. 14 years ago, I had testified in a medical malpractice case at Street Augustine Medical Center. A 61-year-old patient had been discharged too early following cardiac surgery. He died 4 days later at home. His family sued the hospital. I had been the nurse on his floor. I had documented his status. I had raised concerns in writing about the discharge timeline that were overruled by an attending physician with ties to the hospital board. Hargrove Development LLC had been a major investor in the real estate holding company that owned the building Street Augustine leased. The malpractice settlement had threatened to trigger a contractual clause in the lease agreement. There had been pressure, I remembered it now with the cold clarity of something you had stored away, because it was too heavy to carry everyday pressure on the hospital administration to discredit the nursing staff. Documentation. Pressure to make our records look inconsistent. There had been a woman at one of the pre-trial meetings. Silver hair, even then. Trim. A voice that made the air in the room rearrange itself. I sat on the floor of my spare room for a long time. Eleanor had not just looked down on me because I was a single mother. Eleanor recognized me from that conference room 14 years ago, where I had been one of the people whose testimony could not be bought or softened, and whose documentation had been part of what settled that case against the hospital's favor. And now her daughter was marrying my son. I did not go to Daniel immediately. I needed to think. A nurse learns to assess before acting. You do not run into a room shouting. You read the situation. You figure out what is actually wrong before you decide how to help. I asked myself one question. Was Eleanor simply uncomfortable because of old legal history, or was she actively planning something? The answer came the week before the rehearsal dinner when Sophie called me, upset, and told me that her mother had hired a private investigator to look into my financial history and employment records. Sophie was furious. She told me she had found out by accident, seeing an invoice on her mother's kitchen counter. She's looking for something, Sophie said. Something she can use. I know what she's looking for, I said quietly. And I also know she won't find it. But Sophie, I need you to tell me one thing. Does your mother know about the Street Augustine case? There was a pause. She's talked about that case before, Sophie said slowly. When I was in college, she was angry about it. She said a nurse lied on the stand and cost her company a serious amount of money. Sophie's voice changed. That was you. I did not lie, I said. I told exactly what I documented. I told what I saw. Sophie was quiet for a moment, and then she said, I know you did, Margaret. I know. I told Sophie I would handle it calmly. I told her not to worry. I told her to go ahead with the rehearsal dinner and the wedding because her marriage was not going to be held hostage by her mother's old grudges. What I did not tell her was that I had made 2 phone calls that week. One to my attorney, one to the paralegal who had worked on the original Street Augustine case and who I had stayed in loose contact with over the years, just to make sure I understood what I was carrying before I walked into that rehearsal dinner. The dinner was beautiful in the way that expensive rooms can be beautiful, cold and perfect. Flowers on every table, cloth napkins folded into shapes, an open bar that nobody needed but everybody used. I arrived in a navy dress I bought for Daniel's college graduation. I had my hair done. I sat at the family table because Sophie had insisted, and I talked to Daniel's colleagues and Sophie's aunts, and I ate my salad and I was genuinely having a reasonable evening. Until Eleanor took the microphone, until she smiled at me with that steady, weaponized warmth, until I stood up and told her we needed to talk. After I said it, Daniel was on his feet before Eleanor could respond. He looked at me, then at her, and his jaw was set in a way I recognized from the days when he was 16, and had finally grown tall enough to feel like he had the right to stand between me and things that hurt me. Mom, he said, in a low voice. What's happening? Please sit down for now, I told him gently. This is between Eleanor and me. Eleanor had recovered her composure. She turned to the room with a small, gracious laugh. Goodness, emotions run high before weddings, don't they? A few people smiled. The tension loosened by about 10%. She was good at that. But then she looked at me again, and the performance flickered. I said, still calm, still standing, Eleanor, I worked at Street Augustine Medical Center. I was the nursing supervisor on the cardiac floor in 2010 and 2011. I testified in the Hargrove development malpractice case in 2011. I kept my voice even and clear. Not loud, just clear. I imagine you've been thinking about that since the night Daniel introduced us. The room did not understand what I was saying, but Eleanor did. I watched the color leave her face in stages, like someone slowly turning down a light. Sophie, beside Daniel, had gone very still. Eleanor set the microphone down on the nearest table, carefully, and said with a brightness that did not reach her eyes, Margaret, I think you may be confused about. I'm not confused, I said. I remember the case clearly. I remember the deposition. I remember the pressure on the hospital administration to discredit nursing documentation. And I remember that Hargrove Development was represented at every stage of that process. A woman at the next table said softly to her husband, What is she talking about? Eleanor smiled at the room. This is a family dinner, not a courtroom. Perhaps we can. You had a private investigator pull my financial and employment records this week, I said. Not angry, just steady. Sophie found the invoice. I think the room should know that before you finish that sentence. The temperature in the room changed. Daniel said, very quietly. She what? Sophie looked at her mother. Mom, Eleanor's smile was holding on by its edges now. She said, still controlled, I was protecting my daughter. Any mother would do the same due diligence when, due diligence, I repeated. Is that what you call it? I reached into my small clutch purse, the one I almost hadn't brought because I thought it was too formal, and I removed a folded piece of paper. It was a copy of a document my attorney had emailed me 3 days earlier, a summary of a complaint filed with the State Real Estate Licensing Board against Hargrove Development in 2012, 1 year after the malpractice settlement, detailing a pattern of financial pressure on medical institutions to suppress liability documentation. The complaint had been filed. It had been investigated. It had not resulted in formal charges, but it had resulted in a settlement paid quietly and a stipulation that Eleanor's company would not engage with hospital-affiliated real estate contracts for a period of 5 years. I held the paper up so she could see it clearly from where she was standing. Eleanor went pale. I said, "I am not here to destroy you, Eleanor. I never was. I was a nurse who documented what I saw and told the truth about it in a legal proceeding. That is all I have ever done, but you have spent the past 8 months trying to make me feel too small to stand at my son's wedding. You have insulted me in front of his colleagues, his family, and his future wife, and I would like you to understand something." I looked at her directly. I did not survive raising a child alone on a nurse's salary, working nights, studying for recertifications at the kitchen table at midnight, and giving my son every steady thing I could manage to give him. I did not survive all of that to sit quietly while you use a microphone to tell 50 people that I don't know my place. The room was absolutely silent. Eleanor opened her mouth. Sophie spoke first. "Mom, stop." Sophie's voice was not loud. It was exact, the voice of someone who had been waiting a long time to use it. "Stop right now." Eleanor turned to her daughter. Sophie said, "I love you. You know I love you. But you have been doing this since the day I told you I was marrying Daniel. And I need you to hear me right now." She glanced at Daniel, and then looked back at her mother. What Margaret did 14 years ago, she was right. She told the truth. She had documentation. Your company lost money because of how that hospital operated, and she was one of the people who told the truth about it. That is not something she should apologize for, and it is not something Daniel should be punished for. Eleanor's composure finally, fully cracked, not into anger, into something more uncomfortable, into the expression of a person who has been running a story in their head for a very long time and is now standing in a room where the story doesn't hold. She said, very quietly, "Sophie, I'm asking you to apologize to Margaret," Sophie said. "Tonight, in front of these people." The room waited. I watched Eleanor. I could see her calculating. I had watched enough people in difficult moments, in hospital rooms and waiting rooms and hard conversations, to recognize the moment when a person decides which version of themselves to be. She was quiet for almost a full minute. Then she turned to me, and something in her posture changed. Not dramatically, just enough. "Margaret," she said. Her voice was careful. "I was not gracious tonight, or in the months before tonight." She paused. "I carried old anger into something that had nothing to do with it. That was wrong. It was not a full apology. It was not everything. But it was more than I expected." I nodded. Daniel let out a breath. Sophie reached over and took my hand. The rest of the evening was not perfect. It was quiet and a little fragile, the way things are when something invisible finally breaks open and everyone is still figuring out how to breathe around the pieces. Eleanor sat down. She did not take the microphone again. She ate her dinner and spoke to people near her, and she did not look at me for a long time. After dinner, when people were moving toward the exit and the caterers were clearing plates, Sophie pulled me aside near the windows. She said, "I had no idea about the case. The full story. I heard her talk about it years ago like you were the villain. I never thought to look it up." I put my hand on her arm. "You don't owe me an explanation for what your mother believed." "I should have pushed harder to understand," Sophie said. "I should have asked more questions." I shook my head. "You are marrying my son tomorrow. That tells me everything I need to know about your judgment." She laughed, a small wet laugh, and hugged me. Daniel and I sat in my rental car for 20 minutes before I drove back to the hotel. He didn't say much at first. He just sat beside me the way he used to sit when he was small and something had been too big for the day. Finally, he said, "How long have you known?" That I recognized her. I remembered a few months ago. I wasn't sure what she would do with it. He was quiet. "Mom, she's been trying to find a way to use it against you." "Yes," I said. "And you just waited." "I prepared," I said. "There's a difference." He turned to look at me in the dim light from the parking lot. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I said carefully. You love Sophie. And Sophie loves her mother, and I didn't want to make you choose before you had to. I wanted to see if it would come to that. He was quiet again. Did it have to come to what happened tonight? He asked. She took the microphone, I said. She made a choice. Daniel nodded slowly. I'm sorry she said what she said about you, he told me. In front of everyone. Don't be sorry, I said. I've been called worse things by people with less reason. He put his arm around me from the passenger seat, the way grown children sometimes do, a little awkward and completely sincere. I don't know how you stayed that calm, he said. I thought about it for a moment. I stayed calm, I said, because I knew what I was standing on. When you know what's true and you know what you've done, and you know who you are, it's much harder for someone else to knock you down. Even with a microphone, the wedding the next day was one of the most beautiful things I have ever been present for. Sophie walked down the aisle, in a gown that made people catch their breath. Daniel stood at the altar with his hands clasped in front of him, and his eyes bright, and I could see him trying not to cry, and then giving up on not trying. The vows they wrote themselves were honest and funny and specific. They mentioned things that had actually happened between them, inside jokes and hard moments, and the Tuesday he drove 4 hours in the rain because she was sick and didn't want to say so. I sat in the front row and I did not try not to cry. Eleanor was 2 seats from me. We did not speak before the ceremony, but when Daniel kissed his bride and the room erupted, Eleanor and I looked at each other for just a moment across the cheering. She gave me a small nod. I gave one back. It was not forgiveness. Not yet. Those things take longer, and they have to be earned over time with different kinds of evidence. But it was a start, or at least an acknowledgement that a start might someday be possible. A few weeks after the wedding, I received a letter from my attorney. Eleanor's private investigator had formally closed the inquiry into my records, as instructed by the client. My attorney had made clear, in professional language, that any further investigation with intent to harass would constitute grounds for legal action. That had been enough. Daniel and Sophie went to Costa Rica for their honeymoon. They sent me a photo of themselves on a black sand beach with the sun going down behind them, and Sophie laughing at something Daniel said, and Daniel looking at her like she was the most interesting thing in the landscape. I put it on my refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a tomato that Daniel had given me years ago as a joke. 3 months later, Sophie called to tell me she and Eleanor had been in therapy together, that they were working through things, that it was hard but something was shifting. Sophie said. She told me she's been carrying guilt about that case for a long time. Not about the lawsuit, about knowing that the hospital had pushed back on the nursing staff and not saying anything. She said watching you stand up that night she used the word humiliated but not for you. She said she felt humiliated because she knew you were right. I held the phone and looked out the window at my yard, brown and quiet in late October. I said, I hope she finds some peace with it. I mean that, Sophie said softly. I know you do. That's what I told her. I think about that rehearsal dinner sometimes. Not with anger. Mostly with something that feels like clarity. I think about the fact that Eleanor walked into that dinner planning to be the most powerful person in the room, and she probably had been in most rooms she had entered for most of her adult life. Money and authority do something to a person over time. They start to feel like the natural order of things, and then someone sits quietly at your table who saw you in a different kind of room, a long time ago, and knows that the order of things was different before the money came. She was afraid of me, not because I was threatening, because I was a witness, because I had been present at a moment in her life she could not buy her way out of, and I had told the truth about what I saw, and the truth had cost her something real, and I had carried that truth for 14 years without ever using it as a weapon. Not because I was afraid, because I had no reason to use it, because I was a nurse, and then a mother, and I had better things to carry, but I did not throw it away either. And when she took that microphone and smiled at me with those cold, gracious eyes, I was glad I had held on to it. I was raised to believe that quiet endurance was the highest form of dignity, that the most noble thing a woman in my position could do was absorb the weight and keep moving. I believed that for a long time. I still believe patience is a form of strength, but I also know now from watching what happened in that room, from seeing my son's face when I stood up, from hearing Sophie's voice when she told her mother to stop, that silence has a limit, that there is a moment when staying quiet becomes the same thing as agreeing. My mother taught me to be gentle. I taught my son the same thing, but I also taught him something I had to learn the hard way, something that took me decades to fully understand. You can be gentle and firm at the same time. You can speak without raising your voice. You can hold your ground without becoming the thing you're standing against. I did not go to that dinner to fight. I went to celebrate my son's marriage. I was happy. I was proud. And I was not going to let anyone in that room take that from me without understanding what they were taking. That is not drama. That is not unresolved wounds. That is a woman who raised her child alone for 25 years, who worked nights so he could sleep, who cried in 10-minute windows at the kitchen table and then washed her face, who sat in deposition rooms and told the truth even when the truth was inconvenient to people with more money than integrity. That is a woman who knows exactly what she is made of. And the next time someone hands me a microphone or takes one away, I will stand up again. Because that is what I taught my son a mother does, and I have never once regretted it.